Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, joining us online, and maybe good day to you, depends on where you are in the world. And good evening to my panelists here. Welcome back to another session of Fireplace Conversations, where tonight we'll be talking about the role of the board in strategic innovative direction, a full one. And I have with me Desmond Nikanor, and I'm just going to introduce him and just tell you a bit more about him, and then I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists here. Desmond is a specialist strategist and an experienced corporate executive with a specific affinity for strategic management, high-performance culture, establishment, and corporate governance across a number of sectors. He holds a Master's of Science degree in International Business from the University of London, specializing in international management practices pertaining to strategy. So a good fellow to have here with us. He is also a certified director of companies through the Institute of Directors of Southern Africa, as well as a certified balanced scorecard professional with the Balanced Scorecard Institute. He is also a certified organizational culture and change practitioner with the Hofstede, I hope I said it right, Insights Institute of Helsinki, Finland. And then, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And then with me, I have Shiwana Ndeunyema. He specializes on delivering organizational development and business transformation solutions centered across the people strategy system nexus. He's equally at home in business performance management systems, design and implementation. Shiwana serves as the executive business strategy and performance manager or management at NAMCOR, and he also serves on various boards, and we actually serve together on the NAMCOR board. He's on the MIDCO and various other ones. Well, Shiwana is also a partner for people and strategy at Atlantic 3. I hope I'm saying it right, Atlantic 3 Consulting, where he has developed strategy and implemented organizational development solutions for large, small, and medium enterprises in the public and private sectors. He holds a Master's of Science degree in HR with specializations in organizational behavior and performance management from Edinburgh Business School, Heriot-Watt University, and a bachelor's degree in economics honors from the University of Namibia, and other postgraduate qualifications in knowledge management and HR. So another well-skilled person to have on our panel tonight. Chisom, I'm coming to you now. We have a lady here with us. It's Chisom Obiudo. That's a Nigerian surname. I hope I said it right. She is a governance and legal practitioner, currently employed as a senior legal officer at the Namibia Law Reform and Development Commission. Her areas of specialization include corporate governance, advisory and training, legal research, law reform, and policy development. She currently serves as a member of the governance committee at the Namibia Investment Fund and as a part-time governance consultant at the VG Capital Partners. There's so much to say about her too, but I'm just going to go to her educational background, which includes a Master of Laws in Commercial Law with specialization in company law and corporate governance from the University of Cape Town, an LLB degree from Rhodes University, and a certificate in non-executive directorship, integrated reporting, compliance, and legislative drafting. That is that's a mouthful, and I mean, audience, you now know that we actually have skilled people on this panel tonight, and I'm really glad to host you. We're talking about the role of the board in, strategic direction of a company or of an organization. Historically, associations have focused their strategic planning efforts on incremental improvements to current offerings and not on fundamentally creating new value. Now, moving forward, strategic planning will require a focus on innovation, and that's really why we are here tonight, along with leadership adjustments that include an expanded vision, broader inclusion of leadership, and milestone markers for accountability. So, just to start this topic, and I think we touched on it last week, actually, when we were talking about the role of the executive in governance, and a lot of us touched on strategy, but we want to delve into it a little bit more tonight. And the first thing that I want Desmond to speak to us about, which is probably a key thing, it goes without saying in a certain sense, but I mean, people who are not learned in this area probably want to know what is the difference between strategic planning and annual operating plans.
Thanks, Vincia, and good evening to everybody. I think it's a befitting question to start with, because the distinction between the two has to be made very clear. Today's discussion is centering around the role of the board or the governing body. And we all know that according to King 4, the governing body has around 4 main roles: strategy, policy, oversight, and disclosure. Now, that area of strategy and operations, that distinction must be very clear, because if strategy is around the higher level direction of what an organization or entity wants to achieve or strive towards, operations would be the mechanics that allow that to be reached. If I maybe put it in a more conventional example, if you take a soccer team, a professional football team, let's say for instance Barcelona or Real Madrid, these are organizations that have a strategic goal to win the league, to win the Champions League or whatever league they're performing in. However, the tactics they apply as it pertains to on a week-by-week basis, depending on what players they have, depending on what opposition they are facing and the opposition's weakness and strengths, that is the tactics. The strategy remains the same, the tactics change. So that distinction must be quite clear, that operations is a subset of strategy. Now, the way to see its difference is there's around 4 areas how to distinct the difference between the two. If you're wondering, well, then how do I know whether I'm dealing with strategy or with operations? Exactly. So the first one is the time horizon. So strategy is always to the medium to long term, 3 to 5 years or so. It's increasingly getting shorter with time now that the environment changes quite quickly. But whereas operations or tactical management is often reduced to even monthly, weekly, even daily targets. And in fact, the more granular you can become, the better you can track your approach towards your strategic goals. Yeah. It's also different in a sense that one is led by the board and the governing body, the strategy, whereas operations management or tactical management is often led by management and staff. So that clear delineation between the roles is also quite important. I think the best way to really explain it is to just basically understand that strategy is a long-term thing, yes, 3 to 5 years, yes, but in truth, it's executed on a daily basis. Right. There's no other time but the present time. So even if I've set a 10-year goal, that goal depends on what I'm doing tomorrow and the next day. So operations management is really the ability to take those longer, more ambiguous, more vague aspirations and reduce them into very tangible, measurable items and activities that you can track almost on a daily basis. Once you get the difference between those two, it becomes very easy, especially if the two are aligned and if they are done in the correct chronological order.
Okay, I think that's a very clear differentiation between the two, and you've now just mentioned the oversight role and distinguishing that from operations. And I also think that last week we actually really went into that management's role as far as operations is concerned. And Chisom, that brings me to you to just tell us about what is that oversight role in executing that strategic plan effectively. What's the board's role in that?
Well, thank you, Vincia, and good evening, viewers. Well, to provide that strategic oversight, I think what's important, firstly, is that the board needs to constantly educate itself. The board has this duty of skill, care, and diligence. So part of that means that you need to keep yourself well informed on what is happening in the strategic environment in which your company operates in. So how this would happen is that don't limit yourself to the information that management provides you in your board pack, because sometimes the information that management provides, it's not sufficient. So as a board, you need to actually be more proactive. So even if it means going out there and, visiting one of your competitors, engaging with one of your customers, speaking with one of your employees. In fact, I would say it goes deeper than that. Even attending roadshows or attending innovation centers. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we had this Expo on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And for me, I think boards should have attended that, because those are one of the signs of impending dooms to your business model. So by doing that, you can now return to the boardroom, and then you can speak to management, and that way you can actually challenge constructively and critically challenge management's assumptions on the strategy. And how you do that is by asking management the right strategic questions. In fact, that is a core skill that any board should possess. Because if you ask the right questions, then you can gain that understanding. Does management understand the strategy? Have they considered all the issues, the strategic options? Have they considered the risks that are attached to the strategy, which is very important? So some of the questions that you could ask management, you could even invite your chief strategist into the boardroom and ask him, sir, in your view, what do you feel is the strategic environment in your area of responsibility, perhaps maybe 5 to 10 years down the line? How innovative is our strategy? What patterns of demand are we seeing with our consumers? What's happening with our competitors? What are they bringing into their business model that we are not? And how robust is our strategy to actually assess what's happening, and how can we give effect to that? And I can say asking those questions would actually help the board to better provide input into that strategic formulation. So that's the one leg. Yeah, that's the one leg of it. I think the second leg is you also need to be reminded this company exists for who, and is to provide services to your stakeholders. So again, also open the doors of your boardroom to your stakeholders, because they know what you don't know. So bring in your investment analysts, bring in your regulators, bring in your customers, because they can tell you that you are not meeting our expectations, but you thought you were. So those are just one of the things that the board can do as part of its oversight role, asking the right questions.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned stakeholders and so on. And interestingly, my topic next week is about, shareholder centricity versus stakeholder inclusivity. And we'll be speaking to the right people about that. And I don't want to go into that right now, but I want to just go back to that question a little bit deeper and say that, part of the role of the board is perhaps to also ensure that management establishes key documents like policies and plans, so that they can use that as a benchmark, or as a a barometer for oversight, management oversight role that they exercise. And I'm just adding that to what you're saying, because what you have said is very valid. But I think for the board to, because of their fiduciary duties, to be able to point to something that they are going to use to say that we have managed the execution effectively, is also to go back to those policies and procedures and plans that you put into place. And, I just want to go a little bit deeper into, strategic planning, and ask you, Shiwana, to tell us 2 reasons for preparing a strategic plan. Why is it even important? Or I've narrowed it to 2 reasons, but you could tell me more, because I know you have more expertise. Just go for it.
Thank you very much, Vincia, for inviting us to your warm and cozy fireplace.
Very warm.
And good evening to your viewers. That's a very good question. I think the first thing when you look at strategy, you need to look at it from essentially 3 perspectives. The third perspective being a combination of the first 2. Why does the business exist? Any business or entity exists for one of 2 reasons, and it's like I said, the third being a combination of the first 2. The first reason is really to pursue a particular commercial objective by fielding a particular product or service to the market or to some consumers. And then, of course, the second objective would then be to pursue a particular social or a public policy objective or non-profit objective by offering a particular service or products to the market, essentially. And then, of course, the third being a combination of the 2, essentially. So within that context, we then ask ourselves the question, what is strategy? In my considered view, strategy is the ability to anticipate the challenges and opportunities of the future and design solutions today.
Fantastic.
When we talk of challenges, we're essentially speaking about the risks associated with delivering your business, essentially. And opportunities, we're talking about essentially innovation around the products and services that you essentially want to offer. So if you ask me why strategy is very important, is really to identify risk and to identify opportunity. I go further on to say identifying opportunity and challenges in a sustainable way, leveraging those opportunities in a sustainable way. That's where we have the conversation then around the triple P, the triple bottom line. Yeah. So you might ask then, what is the role of the board in relation to strategy? The board is the highest decision-making body in many organizations, in typically almost all organizations. And it's by definition, it's called the board of directors. So principally, their role is to provide direction. And there is no greater function than creating strategy in relation to the board's fulfillment of that role. So one of the challenges, I think, is that, and in governance school, we taught that the role of the board is to participate alongside management in the strategy formulation process. But we seldom find a situation where the board is actively engaged in the strategy formulation process. So you typically have a situation where management and the CEO, they prepare the strategy behind closed doors, and they set up an appointment with the board and present via PowerPoint the strategy and seek the board's approval, essentially. Now, what the danger of that is that denies the board an opportunity to really provide perspective and experience around the areas of their craft in terms of contributing to that strategy. And perhaps most importantly, the challenge with having oversight in the purest terms of the word of strategy as opposed to participation is that the board now you now deny the board an opportunity to appreciate important details of the organization that will allow that particular board to critique opportunities that are presented to the board for approval and decision making, and perhaps most importantly, deny the board an opportunity to identify opportunities for business growth, essentially. So if you then ask what is the role of the board, is really to provide a direction in terms of where the entity is essentially going. I like to use what I refer to as the strategy cascade model. When you develop strategy, the first thing that you need to appreciate is really to understand, why does the business exist? And Simon Sinek really captures this very well in his golden circle, the big why, essentially. So the business needs to exist by virtue of a sense of purpose. So why do we essentially exist? And obviously that is really embedded in our mandate and our articles of association, and if perhaps it's a public enterprise, perhaps in the enabling legislation. So strategy in essence should be geared towards advancing the purpose for which a particular entity was created at the end of the day. I'd like to latch on to the question that you've posed to Desmond, which I thought was an interesting one. So, and then that relates to the difference between strategy and then, of course, your operating plan. And I'll give you an analogy. You're going to Otapi.
Yeah.
The destination is Otapi. We want to get to Otapi. Right. So you ask yourself, how am I going to get there? You can either take the conventional route of Oshivelo, or you can take the back end or to Kamanyap. But the destination is the same. But how you get there is a different conversation. So that's essentially your operating plan. So your goalpost remains Otapi, but then the question that you essentially want to ask yourself is that, first of all, am I going to go with a 4-cylinder Corolla, or am I going to go with the 8-cylinder V8 powered engine, typically? And then you go further on to say, am I going to fly, or am I going to take, road transport, essentially? So those are tactics, but the goalpost remains the same. So the role of the board and management, as it were, is to ensure that you have the most effective mechanism to get to your goal in the most efficient possible manner, essentially.
That was very interesting. I think I picked up a few things along the way as well. And you've mentioned innovation there as well. And I quickly want to, before I get to the innovation part, I want to take you back to what you said about, the board being excluded from the actual process of developing the strategic plan, and only, management bringing it as a recommendation to the board for approval. And, then the board is obviously just at the back end is not at the back end of things, but literally just on a superficial level. How do you think, and what do you suggest or recommend should actually happen?
Yeah, Great. I mean, well, when a board is appointed, sometimes you find what we refer to as a rolling strategy. So they 3 years into their strategy implementation. So the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a typical strategy induction. So management presents the strategy to the board or the director who's been appointed, and they familiarize themselves with the contents of that strategy. And of course, you know, the directors need to make a concerted effort to actually understand the business and, you know, do some self-reading essentially. So that's the first point. The second is really to ensure that the directors offer based on their expertise in the areas of their craft. So if I'm appointed on the board as a legal expert, you need to critique with a legal lens that strategy, and that's how value add is offered essentially. And that's why you typically have a board with diverse skill set, so that you offer holistic critique to the strategy through that sort of value add.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important, because that skill set is actually what adds to what management can do for a company when they're executing that strategy. So while management is executing strategy, board can ask the right questions. You've mentioned asking the right questions. Asking the right questions is very key. I think in my, you know, not just a tenure, but in my corporate governance work, I think the one thing I've learned, which is very critical, is for boards to ask the correct questions. Even when the information is not necessarily before you, anticipate what information should be brought to you. And what you've mentioned was key, because when you know your business or the industry where you're going to serve as a board member or as a governing body member, you then will understand the correct questions that you should ask. And you know that, Desmond, I see you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I wanted to add to that.
Yeah.
How to ensure that the board is adding value throughout the process,
Right.
especially of strategic management. So strategic management, it's a broad field, and it's split up in around 5 different sections, from strategy formulation, strategy development, monitoring, execution, implementation, evaluation, reporting. Right. So all of those, let me say, aspects have to be ingrained in how the board is able to provide oversight into the organization. So what I mean is, often we see that the board is almost introduced into the process in on an ad hoc basis.
Right.
A quarterly basis if they are lucky, and if not, at 1 or 2 strategic events. And often that's the only time they get to consume and digest that type of information. But we spoke about the 3 roles of the board, one being oversight. If you break that word up, oversight, it literally means over and sight, looking above looking, or overlooking maybe is a better way to put it. And overlooking means that the board ideally should either ingrain downwards, or management, to put it up, processes to provide oversight that is continuous. That is oversight is achieved through many areas, either before taking a decision or after. The before is how decisions are taken, the platforms, the due diligence that is enshrined, and after is around management reporting, looking at the annual financials and all of that. So reporting is almost post factor. Reporting by definition means you are looking back at what has taken place. So often that's a little bit too late. But if you are able to ingrain, for instance, I've seen many organizations that ingrain this type of thinking and conversation on a monthly basis through some type of a reporting structures, or through the subcommittee meetings. I think if you ingrain it a little bit better, and I always say that perhaps the most salient point I would always like to point out in this area is that the area of designing strategy by means of a strategic retreat is not an event. It's not a 2-day event, because strategy cannot be developed in 2 days. It is really unfair to expect any professional to be able to apply themselves on the totality of all the factors that must be considered in a 2 or 3-day event. No, it must be the culmination of a 365-day process that is continuously going on. I think you'll find much more joy and drawing from the skills of the directors.
How do we achieve that practically, that culmination?
So it has to be built into how the organization runs systemically. Yeah. So for instance, where I work and the areas that we try to enshrine, the way we report is both looking forward and looking back. The timelines, turnaround times of reporting is on a monthly basis. So the board, if anything is amiss in terms of our strategic direction or our assumptions, the board will be able to pick it up within 3-4 weeks of us putting that into effect, as opposed to us waiting 6 months or 12 months before they can apply that. As a result, you'll find that your strategic engagements, when they come in event form, is you are not really giving them new information that they don't know. It is more to say, directors, you've been aware of this issue that has been coming up. It's been appearing on our monthly management reports or feedback reports or our dashboards. We are now proposing a solution. But in truth, they've had months to consume this issue, and then you just use that platform to come to a solution. Yeah.
Okay, so there's just so much that I want to discuss tonight, because you're bringing up very salient factors as you're talking, and I wish we had more time, but yeah, we still have time to continue talking, but I wish we had more time, like a day, to just sit down and canvas these issues, because I think as the audience are listening, they also, asking questions in themselves and, getting more information. And for me, it's very intriguing, I must say, this very session. And I just now want to ask Shiwana, can you speak to me about the good characteristics, or what are the key characteristics of a good strategy?
Okay.
What would you say?
Right. So I think the first thing, and I was having a good conversation with a learned colleague of mine in industry, and he pointed out something very interesting, and he shared that we need to take a different perspective around how we perceive our organizations relative to our competition. Right. So let's take the organization where I work, for instance, at NAMCOR. So our competition conventionally, we're competing against Total, Engine, Puma, and the likes, essentially. But given this global age and at the backdrop of reduced economic activity, our competition is no longer the folks that we're operating with in industry. Our competition is MTC. Our competition is NBC. So, and we're competing for the share of the wallet. So then we ask ourselves, why should our customers essentially take out $50 Namibian and spend it on petrol, as opposed to spending it on buying airtime, as opposed to spending it on paying their TV license typically, or buying Kapana from the Kapana guy, essentially. So that's very important in terms of the context of how we approach strategy. You asked the question around the characteristics, and I'd like to relate it to the role of the board. The board's role is really to keep a tab on strategy execution after the strategy has been formulated. Because remember, strategy is organic. What is true today may not be true tomorrow, right? So the conversation around data is very important, and I often joke in our boardroom to say data is the new oil. So data is very important. So data-driven strategic planning and thinking is very critical to a good strategy around that sort of characteristic question that you've asked. So the hallmark of a good strategy is its ability to address a problem. You ask, if there's no problem, well, you find one.
Right.
And the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, did it? Right?
Yeah.
So, and Steve Jobs is a good example, and I think he was very innovative in his strategic thinking. He came up with the touchpad, and his peers were like, but why are you coming up with something like this? Did the consumers ask for this? He said, no, they don't know that they need it. Yeah. So sometimes need is foisted upon us. And then that's the role of strategy, really, thinking out of the rudimentary scope. Right. And there's a concept I like very much. It's called ecosystems thinking. So you don't, generally when you craft strategy, you throw up your value chain from A to Z, and you think around that. But ecosystems thinking essentially means that you look beyond the environment that you're operating and identify opportunities outside of that space based on a particular problem. I'll give you an example at NAMCOR. One of our biggest challenges was we are recipients of a 7.6 cents per litre fuel levy from the Namibian government through the Ministry of Mines and Energy. Now, our operations are quite heavily dependent on that levy in terms of our operating expenses. Now, as part of developing our strategy, we've identified a problem to say, we face an existential threat. If the ministry decides to pull this right under our feet, our existence is at risk, essentially.
Yeah.
So your strategy needs to be formulated around how you're going to address that particular risk. So alternatively, you need to identify alternative revenue streams, essentially.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons why we decided to pursue international oil producing assets, as you've probably read in the mainstream media, where we in the process of acquiring oil producing assets in the Angolan oil fields, essentially. So once you're able to identify a problem and charge towards that problem and formulate your strategy around that problem, you've got a good thing going.
And I think, we're certainly running out of time, but still got a few things to touch. And you've just brought out that, you've mentioned a few things, the risks, challenges, opportunities, and also just creating the need for people to, before they already see the need. And innovation, you've kept mentioning that, and I like that, because in this age that we are post-COVID, and we're not even post-COVID yet, we're literally still dealing with COVID in a sense, but a lot of things have changed. There's a lot of ESG talks, and that will be one of the topics if the audience are a little baffled about what it is. ESG talks will be coming up soon. And then we have things like hybrid, meeting methods and a lot of other changing, landscapes and environments in an organization. How is strategic planning different now that we are evolving in corporate governance landscape? Chisom, can you just talk to us about that?
Okay, I would say because of this accelerated pace of change that we're seeing in the business environment, particularly technology is now coming in and it has changed the way business run their business model. So the question I would want to ask is, sorry, let me just rephrase it. One of the issues right now, like you just mentioned, ESG. I think this is a trending topic right now all over the world, but unfortunately, it's still a foreign language in Namibia. But recently, I came across something in the media that the Namibian Stock Exchange has now made it a listing rule for listed companies to report on ESG. So I think, for example, the board like NAMCOR, they would want to be interested in that. So they should really be asking the question, why is ESG important for our company? What is that? So ESG is environmental, social governance. Why should we bother about that environmental aspect of ESG? I think another thing that we're seeing is that strategy is also linked to your board composition. And I think that's a conversation boards are having right now. Like, because of this anticipated change, because we see all these emerging technologies coming in, artificial intelligence, digital disruption. So the board is really having the conversation now, what can we do about our current directors? Do we need to upskill them? What skills do they need? And we have to think about it. They need technological skills. They need digital skills. So what can we do about it? Even if you can't afford to train them, you could get a consultant to come and train them, especially a consultant that is innovative, who lives and breathes innovation. That's another way of looking at it.
What can you say are some of those key changes in corporate governance these days? I mean, you've mentioned ESG.
ESG.
I've mentioned hybrid meeting methods, for instance. What are other things that you can think about that are happening post or during COVID that we have had to think differently about? Because Shiwana has just mentioned you can't think in a rudimentary manner anymore. You've got to think out of the box. And what are those things that are forcing us to think out of the box, like ESG, for instance?
Yeah, okay. So I would say as businesses are moving to become more digital, there are now threats of cyber attacks. So cybersecurity is now becoming another risk, which should take place as a strategic conversation at the forefront. So you also need to look at, do we need skills on the board in terms of how do we address cyber risks? And like you just said, data protection issues.
And also, I mean, what has also come to, just to add on to that is that personal dynamics such as, hybrid work models. And I think it's something that we're also discussing on our boards. And I hope many boards are talking about issues like these, like, it's not conventional anymore to just, work in an office. Some people are working from home, and it has become more conventional that way. And we need to address those kind of issues. And I think boards just need to start knowing what are the key things that they need to know are evolving in this time, and what are those topics that we should be talking about at the board table. Do you want to add to that, Desmond?
Yeah, I do. I want to add to just what she touched on, and also what Shiwana started on. You see, the change, the rapid changing environment has brought a whole different way of approaching strategy. Strategic management, or as it unfolds, rather, strategic monitoring and execution has two broad concepts. You have your planned strategy and you have your emergent strategy. Now, if you just make a simple Google search, it's always implied that there's this arrow, that's the planned strategy, and the emergent strategy is sort of a side arrow that you must just factor in and maneuver when things change. But in truth, at the moment, we have to almost put higher priority on emergent strategy. And in truth, governing bodies and boards simply, and executives and management and staff have to be able to stomach change, even to the most well put together plans. And I think in my short experience, I found that that's partly one of the hardest thing to do, is if they've spent a whole process perhaps coming together with a specific direction, and then maybe 8 months down the line, there's been a fundamental change in the environment. Just the ability to depart from that and recognize that there was a change, recognize what was the change, recognize what the change did to us, and then also recognize what to do about the change. Those 4 decisions, the ability to do that is so important. The one thing that Shiwana touched on, which is always my point of departure, it is 100% correct, it's purpose. When there is fundamental change in the environment, you have to solidify and clarify your purpose, because any good strategy emanates from purpose. The clearer the purpose, the easier it is to develop a strategy around it, and the more likelihood you will achieve it. If I take a very simple local environment, we look at Rossing Uranium Mine. I mean, this is an impressive business. It's the largest open cast mine in the world, the second largest producer of uranium in the world. It's a formidable business. It's been around before I was alive. And this business changed hands a few years ago. Now you must ask yourself, what would make one large investor find this business no longer suitable and one other large investor find it very suitable? It is the purpose between the two. It was initially owned by Rio Tinto, which had commercial impetus, as he mentioned, commercial and public. And when they did their assessments based on different commodity prices, or rather dropping commodity prices, which is a change in the environment, the suitability of the business in relation to the purpose of the entity changed. However, it was taken up, same business, same fundamentals, everything, taken up by a new consortium, or the Chinese Nuclear Uranium Company, because the impetus was more around securing a supply of uranium. You understand? Same business, same commodity, the two different purposes meant totally two different strategies and how they deploy and acquire assets. So those two things are so important. In essence, they talk about strategists being futurists, and I'm beginning to appreciate that a little bit more, because the further down you go into the future, the more likelihood there is for change to come. Something becomes predictable to probable to unlikely as time goes further. So your ability to really adjust as things are changing, which we are seeing now. I mean, last year we saw businesses that have once again been around before I was alive, Fortune 500 businesses that were wiped out.
Collapsed,
Yes, purely because the purpose behind which it was established or under which it was established was deemed obsolete by this thing called COVID-19. So that part is extremely important, I think.
And so I think I hear you talk about dynamism and not being stagnant, because, once you remain stagnant, and he's mentioned it before, the Stone Age, if you had remained stagnant, a lot of other competing interests and businesses would obviously far exceed where you are, and you can become obsolete, for instance. Yeah. So I think, and that's the focus today, innovation. Things are evolving, things are dynamic. What are we going to do? And that brings me to my key question, that what can boards do to refocus their strategic planning on innovation? I'm now looking at all three, because this time I actually want all three of you to help me answer that question, because we're coming to a close and I have perhaps one or two questions that I'd like to pose. But this, I think, is a key thing, and link that to what are the questions that the board should ask? What are the key considerations that board should be asking in these changing times? You have mentioned a few of them, but just hone into that a little bit in terms of, what should the board do to refocus? Shiwana, you look like you're eager to get this one.
Well, look, that was a very good question, by the way, around post-COVID-19 era.
Yeah, you could start with that.
Yes,
Yeah.
And then I'd like to tie it with your question around that particular issue. So the COVID-19 era was very uncertain, Strategic business plans were replaced with business continuity plans.
Right.
Why? Because our strategies was thrown out the window, And the business continuity plans were predominantly survival plans.
Rescue plans.
Rescue plans, if you like, to keep the business afloat. So business effectively, and I call it the triple R. We've moved from, first of all, it was responding. How do we respond to COVID-19, right? How do we react to the staff in terms of how the emotions that they're going through? Thirdly, how do we recover? That was very important. The fourth element is how do we thrive? And this is where boards resort to pitching, bridging that gap between recovering and thriving. Because the conversation around COVID-19 is no longer going to fly with boards. And if you're not delivering on your targets and you're still giving the COVID-19 excuse, you've got the wrong game going. So the strategy needs to be positioned to the extent that it's able to adapt to the prevailing changing environment, essentially. So that's that particular issue around thriving in relation to strategies is essentially important. How do we do that, you may ask? There's a concept I like called intrapreneur. If you Google it, it won't pop up, but if you search it, it will pop up. Intrapreneur.
Yes.
The intrapreneur is, by contrast, typically your entrepreneur is somebody who runs their own business for a particular objective. Intrapreneur is somebody who essentially runs somebody else's business for a particular objective. However, they are commercially astute individuals who've got a good appreciation for business. So they're essentially good business women and men who are running somebody else's business. So that is what we need essentially at management level and at board level. You want a board that is able to get into the engine room, not the gearbox, because there you're becoming operational now.
Yes.
So get into the engine room and really have conversations around the issues that the entity is essentially facing, and agreeing on those, how to address those issues essentially. And I come back to the strategy cascade model. So the questions that the board needs to ask is, what is our purpose? What is the big why, essentially? Secondly, where do we want to play? Those are the markets that you're essentially talking. Do we want to service a particular segment? Are we servicing the private sector, the public sector, whatever the case may be? Thirdly, how do we win? These are essentially your lag measures, your key performance indicators, your metrics, if you like. So how does success look like essentially? Fourthly, is what are those dynamic capabilities that will give us a sustainable competitive advantage? Remember, in the past, the conversation was around competitive advantage. But we saw what quickly happened to Nokia.
Yeah.
It was not sustainable. They had a competitive advantage, but it was short-lived.
Right.
So you need to understand what are those sustainable competitive advantage dynamic capabilities that Desmond spoke about, dynamic capabilities that our competitors can essentially, that our competitors are essentially unable to replicate, right? And within this context, you're obviously talking about a commercially oriented entity and not your sort of social and public policy objective. And the last one, and perhaps ultimately, is your management systems. What management systems do you need to have in place to be able to, these are your lead measures, how you go about delivering that which you've essentially committed. So once the board is able to ask those questions, what is our purpose, the big why, how will we win, what are those dynamic capabilities, what management systems are in place, and how are they doing in fulfillment of that big why, I think we've got a good game going.
They can direct properly.
That's correct.
Yes. Chisom?
Okay, just to add on to what he said, I think with regards to the vision, innovation should actually be a strategic board agenda, because it should be part of how do we achieve that vision. And really, it's not the board's role to innovate. It's really management to hold that pen. But what the board can do is, like he said, ask those relevant questions. But again, I would say we also need to look at what is the culture in the organization. And I think Desmond has said it numerous times in his articles that there's a saying in governance that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So no matter how good your strategy is, if the culture is bad. So as a board, what you need to do, you need to say, how can we support management and the company, to take more risks? How can we encourage them that, okay, it's fine to fail, because innovation is risky. We innovate and it might not work out. It might cost the company a lot of money. So you need to be able to support the board to feel that it's okay for us to fail. So another question that I want boards to think about is, what are the consequences of failure in your organization?
Right.
Yeah. Because like I said, innovation is risky. So what happens if one of the staff members brings up a new innovative idea, a new way of doing something, and then it costs the company millions of dollars? Because the answer to that would give an indication to how your risk culture embraces innovation. So if your staff member is going to be fired, punished, fined, then for me, that is anti-innovation. And what happens is that you're going to have innovative staff members leaving your company because you are not embracing innovation. So they would leave to join other companies that are more innovative. So I think the board really needs to help management have that support, that it's okay to take risks and we can fail, but we need to fail fast so that we can get back up again. Yeah.
And that's the Nokia analogy that you just posed earlier. Desmond?
Yeah, I regret going third because
because everything is said. I'm sure you have a lot to say.
On my notes, I think they could see my notes from here. But no, I'll start with what Chisom said, and that is that from the board, innovation has to be fostered.
Right.
It really has to be fostered. It's a nurturing environment that has to be deliberately created from the top. We are fortunate that in the beginning of this year, we got a new board chairperson, and she one day took me aside, and she tasked firstly the strategy unit. I head up the strategy unit, but management at large, to really look at instituting not only innovation in terms of it being present in our strategic documents, but the whole concept of it, holistically. And so I'm fortunate to answer this question because it's also I've been digesting this for some months now, how to get it right. But she touched on it perfectly. And maybe if I can just condense all my small findings for the past few months, is that I found that an organization basically is a ecosystem of three things. It's people, it's systems, and it's processes. So to entrench anything, really, you need to touch on all three of those. So on the people side, she touched on it. I don't even need to go there from many aspects, especially what I like about what she said, and I think I wrote it down, it must be fine to fail. And it's the first thing I've noticed. Sometimes I spend a lot of times with different rooms and different audiences, and I found that there's a different appetite for failure, even when reporting back.
Right.
Mm.
And all of it immediately, like clockwork, if that exists, then you go into defensive mode and you don't take any new territory.
Right.
No one takes new territory because you are just spending your time accounting and defending to the board. It's one of the most subtle yet detrimental cultural aspects that I've come across. And then the rest I think she touched on. On the process side, policies must speak to innovation. So it's so basic that I almost overlooked it. But if your policies are set in stone, and they say that the head of HR can only do this X, Y, and Z, then of course they do not have the liberty to deviate from that. Otherwise they would be charged. But if your policies are structured in such a way that yes, there's controls, internal controls, but there is leeway to allow for just yes, innovation and deviation, if it's of course in the best interest of the organization, that's very important. The more restrictive your policies are, and if they read like legal documents, then you will create a workforce that operates in that manner.
In a rudimentary, yes.
And then the last one is your systems, and once again, Shiwana touched on that, is data. One of the things that I in any place when I go into, I look at what type of reporting we are digesting. And at a certain level, there's a difference between digesting about what has happened, but if you're looking at what has happened, then it must at least boil over to, okay, what does that mean for us and what should we do? And the whole aspect of management information systems, meaning you are consuming data, making it information, making it knowledge, making it wisdom. And that information that every organization produces on a daily basis, thousands and thousands of data points in any organization, even a soccer team or a family, produces data every day. Your ability to collate that, interpret it and say, okay, I see why this has happened, but the most important question is what should we do about it? And then to have the ability and the agility and the flexibility to change the rules of your organization to cater for that. The quicker you can do that, the better. And that's why I really feel for instances where perhaps an organization is governed by a piece of legislation, because it's very difficult to deviate from that, I can understand. And you can understand why two organizations, same product, same service, same industry, one public, one private, the ability to be innovative is completely different because of those type of dynamics. So I think that would be my contribution there on innovation.
And we quickly coming to an end of this session, which was packed with so much wisdom, so much knowledge. I'm hoping, that the right people are watching, the board of directors are actually watching this, that management is also watching this, because both entities need to understand their role, correctly for this to work for every type of entity. So I'm just going to go quickly to two questions. And Chisom, I want you to answer this one. And the last question, I would like the two strategists to answer for me. So the one to yourself, what is the role of the legal advisor or the company secretary during and after strategic planning or after the sessions? Just a short one. What is the role of the legal advisor or company secretary during and after the strategy session? What is their role?
I think, during the strategy session, I think the company secretary, she can also play a strategic role by providing that input. So I think with the company secretary, you are that gateway of information. So I think you can also support the board by looking outside what is happening in that current environment and provide the board with that information to engage with the strategy. And then after the strategic session, I think it's just to go back and look at, okay, the board has approved the strategic plan. Okay, what are the goals now that we need to, or what are the objectives that we need to undertake to reach those strategic plans? And that way the secretary can support the CEO in his performance roles.
Okay, and just to add quickly on that one is that, as a liaison person, the company secretary and legal advisor perhaps sometimes in a match role should always be on the outlook to ensure that critical agenda items are on the agenda, because many a times we find that they leave out items, and obviously management is not looking for that, but as a liaison person, this is basically their role.
I think and just to add to that on the agenda item, I think that's the problem also. That's also a challenge with the strategy, especially if you overload the board with too much information. So the company secretary actually needs to set out for the board, what is this information that I just want you to take note of? What is this information that I feel that we should discuss? And what is this information that you need to make a decision on? So I think that's a skill that the company secretary needs to have. How do you create a strategic board agenda? What strategic issues would you put in, and what risks would you attach to that?
Right, yes. So my last and final question to the two gentlemen is, a strategist, and you brought up a very important idea or point about entrepreneurship. which is probably one of those evolving things that the board should be looking at. And I think we'll find a session to just talk about that and probably invite you back to that session. But now, speaking about that, the importance of that, as well as strategists, how can boards use strategists to come up with better ways to direct companies in an innovative manner? Are you even necessary on boards? Like, not necessarily as board members, but outside, in that sense of entrepreneurship, are you important, and how important are you? Shiwana.
Okay. Sorry, there's just a pet peeve that I just want to get out of the way.
Yes.
It relates to the question that you posed.
Right.
There's a bit of a misnomer around the role of the company secretary, the legal advisor in the organization, and it's often relegated to pushing papers and agendas and so forth. But we often forget that the company secretary, first and foremost, is a lawyer, right? And I like analogies. I'll give you an example. So the Jamaican 4x100 team, it's competing for the Olympics, essentially. So the goal is to win the Olympics and break the record. So you need to ensure that they are compliant. So that's typically the role of the company secretary. They need to look at the strategy through a legal lens and say, listen, because remember, entrepreneurs can be very ambitious. You get business executives and board of directors that are very ambitious in their strategic thinking. So they come up with an innovative idea and they say, let's go for it. Right. Then the company secretary needs to come in and say, this is not within the confines of the law.
Yes.
Legally, this is how we can maneuver around it. Otherwise, you find yourself, and many organizations have found themselves in a situation where they're executing the wrong strategy perfectly well. And that's really because you haven't really looked at things from a legal perspective. So the company secretary has a very important role to play in directing the conversation around strategy at board level, because remember, the company secretary reports to the CEO, solid line, and dotted line report to the board of directors. So
solid line to board and dotted to CEO.
You, the governance expert, yes. It's important, and I hope the company secretaries are listening. It's important that they understand, and I've sat in a lot of boardrooms where their role is really to capture minutes and ensure that the recording is on and so forth, but their role is to make sure that they offer legal advice to those sitting around the table. Your question, whether we are actually needed in the boardroom as strategists?
And well, not as directors necessarily, but because now we've been talking about boards thinking innovatively.
Yes.
Don't they need strategists to help them?
Yeah. So and then I always share this, I liken the role of a strategist to that of a midwife. So the midwife doesn't deliver the baby. They are catalysts for the delivery of the baby. The midwife is there to make the labor pains less painful. Well, I have no experience, but of course, that's
maybe more bearable.
More bearable,
yes.
And so the strategist is not necessarily the one that comes up with ideas, because you've got specialists who are specialized in the area of their craft. Typically, NAMCOR, for instance, we've got seismic geologists, development and production, upstream, downstream, supply and logistics. Those are the specialists. They are in the better position than myself as the strategist to actually come up with innovative ideas. My role as a strategist is to create a conducive environment to germinate those ideas essentially, and package them and articulate them and take them to the next step, which is essentially implementation, monitoring and evaluation, as Desmond indicated essentially. Yeah.
Desmond, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I may be biased, but I definitely think the role of a strategist is really pronounced. And when I remember when we first began, so we set up the strategy unit from scratch. It didn't exist in the beginning. And one of the first tasks that I put upon myself was to define the characteristics of the strategy office. Because like he said, especially ideal in the industry where I'm never the most skilled or knowledgeable person in the room. Never. I'm dealing with people who are experts in their own right. However, there is this glue function, the central oversight sort of helicopter view function that a strategist should and shall have to allow them to bring all of those pieces together in order to achieve the very purposes of the organization. So I think when I condensed and reduced my whole role, or the role of the strategy office, I actually have it on my letterhead, on my board letterhead. We said we are impartiality, it's advisory, and it's perspective. It's those three things in a very servanthood manner, serving the purpose of the entity. So I think to answer your question, what boards can do is to perhaps, I can't say allow for it, but yes, to allow for a strategist to do what they need to do in terms of bringing those different pieces together, to respect the processes. Often I see that boards want to perhaps microwave things, something that should take 6 months of good work, they want to do in a week and all of that, is to really respect the process. I really respect the process. And I think with the perspective that the outcome is really for their own good. Yeah. The board is the one that is tasked to set and steer direction, and the strategist is there to assist them and help them to do so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this was very charged with knowledge, like I've said before, and I keep emphasizing it. It was a very good session. Thank you so much for gracing us with your wisdom and knowledge, Desmond, Chisom, Shiwana. I hope to have you back on another session because this was very insightful. I know you have a lot more to offer. We want to thank our viewers for joining us online and for the questions that you posed. Please join us next time, same time on a Thursday for our next session on Fireplace Conversations. Thank you for joining us and have a good evening.